Our first speaker today, Dominic Johnson, is a WildCRU alumnus. He did his DPhil on evolutionary biology with us, and then he thought that he was never going to live on a meager biology salary, so he went to Geneva and did a PhD on political science. That took him to great appointments, and we were fortunate to get him back at Oxford a few years back, where he's now professor of politics and international relations at the Department of Politics. Dom is also a co-director of the Smith School program on nature governance, and he's going to be talking about how to overcome I wish I could read my own writing. Anarchy, that's a great word, in international relations. Over to you, Dom.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Thank you for having me back. I left WildCRU 20 years ago to foray into politics. I'm glad David has decided to join me 20 years later. It's wonderful to be here. So let me contribute to the gloom fest that we've had so far before lunch. If you thought it was bad because of the economic factors or bad because of the developing infrastructure, let me tell you why it's also bad from the perspective of international relations. And in the spirit of this interdisciplinary venture, I thought I would start out by trying to explain a little bit about international relations and the main theories within the field and how that shapes how they see the world. So this year is actually the centenary of the founding of our field. International relations as a discipline began in 1919 with the first chair of international relations at Aberystwyth University, and it was partly inspired by the catastrophe of World War I. And that was the war, of course, that people thought was the war to end all wars. And the problem was we didn't have anyone studying it very systematically in the academy. And of course, World War I was a big problem, but it is a problem that had been going on for a long time. This is a timeline going from 1500 to 2015, measuring the percentage of years that great powers were at war with each other. Now, the last half decade or so has been somewhat encouraging, but for the many centuries before, this had been a perennial problem. And up here at 100%, you've got great powers at war with each other all the time. Now, some of you may have been to Steve Pinker's talk in Oxford a couple of days ago, where he has a much more optimistic message that things are getting better. But it depends on what you measure. The graph I just showed you was great power wars between states. These are represented by the dashed line here, but the solid line is the number of ongoing civil wars within states, which unfortunately has been getting a lot worse as interstate wars have declined. And there's a dip here, but ever since, particularly because of the Syrian conflict, this has gone up again significantly. So I think we're here because we want states to cooperate with each other to solve conservation problems which don't have borders. In international relations, a lot of the focus is on the opposite, conflict. That cooperation is a nice ideal, but we've got a lot of conflict to resolve before we can even start talking about cooperation, and war is sort of the worst possible metric, if you like. So why can't we all just get along? Let me outline the problem of anarchy, which helps understand that. Outline some core theories of international relations which give different perspectives on what we should do given this problem of anarchy. Then I want to focus a little bit on territorial conflicts. I think it's quite relevant to conservation problems and the problems that we face. But the point really is just that there are some serious, I would say ugly problems to overcome in the international arena. So what is this problem of anarchy? Well, international relations, as I said, has only been around 100 years. It's still a relatively young field compared to many others. And it actually lacks much consensus about anything. Basic assumptions and motivations within the field are hotly contested. The same events are often interpreted very differently. You can always identify multiple causes of any behavior. And an example is World War I, for example. 100 years on, we're still arguing about the causes of that war with diametrically opposed views of who began it, why, and what the underlying motivations were. So all international relations theory remains hotly debated. It makes it great fun, but but a little bit miserable sometimes. And there are certainly no laws like there are in some natural sciences that we can cling to. There is one point of broad consensus, though, perhaps, and this is the so-called problem of anarchy. What is the problem of anarchy? Within states, this is the domain of domestic politics. The problem of collective action is at least potentially solvable because you have a government sitting above citizens which can enforce laws, compel cooperation, and punish people who don't. It doesn't always work very well, but at least in theory it's possible. So domestic politics is one thing. But it's very different at the level of international politics between states. It's entirely different. Cooperation is extremely hard because there is no government that sits above states that could compel behavior or enforce it. There is no overarching authority, or Leviathan, as Thomas Hobbes called it. There's nothing to protect states, ultimately, and to prevent conflicts. And this is the so-called anarchy of international politics. So collective action problems are harder, and they cannot always be resolved. Now, at this point, people think, well, hang on a second, what about the UN and all the many other international institutions? Yes, they exist. They're very good. They do a lot of good things. But ultimately, they are limited. They're not sovereign, so they're not always necessarily going to be able to compel states to do what they want. And often they actually reflect power differences rather than leveling them. So they are not a panacea. And all of this may seem very simple, but it's actually a really important difference between the field of international relations, the problem of politics between states, and the field of political science, which is the politics, at least partly, within states. So, anarchy is a problem. What do different theories of international relations say about it and how we can overcome it? So, at a hugely simplistic level, we can divide up all international relations theories into these three: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And this is a very helpful little graph of these theories from an article by Jack Snyder a few years ago, where he divides realists, liberalists, and idealists. And I'll just quickly go through all of them. Realism, what's this? So this is the theory originated by people like Hans Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz. And today you have people like Stephen Walton, John Mearsheimer at Harvard and Chicago, respectively, who advocate these theories. And the other thing Jack Snyder wanted to do is to point out that our politicians and our leaders don't necessarily have a theory of international relations they're enacting, but the way they behave, if you like, corresponds to a certain kind of worldview which you can identify as one of these theories. So here you have Otto von Bismarck, the ideal kind of realpolitik statesman of the 19th century, and then people like Henry Kissinger more recently, who behave like realists. What do realists say? Realists say that international politics is driven by power politics. It's the old cynical view of international politics. That states fundamentally conduct their foreign policy on the basis of calculated power gains, very importantly, in relation to other states. As long as I'm doing better than you, I'm okay. Classical realism used to focus on human nature. This is a problem of human nature, and we can't get away from it because this is what human beings are like. But during the last 50 years or so in the field, people moved away from that idea about human nature being the problem and focused very much on the structure of the international system. That it's not human nature, it's the structure of the international system which compels states to behave like this. The anarchical international system threatens state security ultimately. States are self-help states because they can only rely on themselves. And weak or vulnerable states risk exploitation. So power is, unfortunately, even if we don't want it to be the case, essential if you are to be secure and to survive. So what do states do as a result? They seek power and they seek to preserve power. So what are the implications of this theory? Well, very pessimistic, of course. I should say that, at least in the United States, realism remains a dominant theory in the discipline. I think a lot of people, especially in Europe and the United Kingdom, see it as a very kind of cynical, outdated view, but it's very prominent in Washington as well as in the academy. The key problems are that states look out for themselves, there's a distinct lack of trust, there's a problem of security dilemma, I arm myself to protect myself, but you don't know that's the reason I'm doing it, so you arm in response. And you're in this spiral of armament races. It's all about relative gains. I want to stay ahead of you. It's not about zero-sum absolute gains, which would be a lot easier to promote cooperation within. And as much as we might doubt it, there is lots of good evidence going way back before the birth of our discipline, suggesting that this has actually been been successfully explaining a lot of interstate politics for at least 2,500 years, back to Thucydides' famous history of the Peloponnesian War. It's very simple, but the argument is that it gives us timeless truths about interstate politics. It doesn't explain everything, but it explains a lot. Pretty pessimistic. What about liberalism? Liberalism is more optimistic, and this comes from the kind of Enlightenment liberalists like Adam Smith and Immanuel Kant, and today, or recently, has been kind of represented in Snyder's view by people like Bill Clinton and Kofi Annan. Now, liberalists also accept the problem of anarchy, but they argue that we're in the state of anarchy, but there are lots of reasons why we're moving steadily away from it. And the three main reasons are because of economic interdependence, because of international institutions, and because of the success of democracy. Very briefly, economic interdependence, why is that so good? Because states are increasingly entangled and interconnected through trade and finance and globalization. So that means any conflict between them or any actual lack of cooperation is hugely costly, even to a potential winner in a conflict. So it threatens prosperity for everyone. I've put in red some critiques from a realist. What would they say? One thing they point out is that people thought war between Germany and the United Kingdom was impossible in 1914 because they were each other's biggest trading partner, and it didn't prevent a great power war between them. So people are skeptical of how powerful this is, but it's one important argument. The other one, of course, the first one that people think of, is the role of international institutions. That states, and particularly democracies, actually are very cooperative, especially when they have transparent domestic politics, and they're willing to conform to international institutions and adhere to international law, then they can achieve a lot. You can put self-interest and short-term interest aside, and the collective interest can at least be coordinated to help states find long-term solutions. Realists point out that, yes, these institutions exist, they're quite significant, but when the stakes are high, they break down. And there are certain states, powerful states in the system, which do what they want. So again, they're not a panacea. This is probably the thing that has captured most excitement and attention in the field, and this is the democratic peace theory. And if you just look at the data from the big Correlates of War data project in the United States, which tracks the incidents and characteristics of war over the last couple of centuries since the Napoleonic Wars, you find this very simple result, and you don't need any statistics. Non-democracies fight each other a lot, about 200 of the wars in that data set. Non-democracies and democracies also fight each other quite a lot, 155 wars in the data set. But when you look at democracies fighting democracies, they never fight each other. Now people start questioning this. Well, what about Israel, Lebanon, for example? So maybe there are some exceptions, but even if there are a few exceptions, the difference is remarkable. And this has given rise to democratic peace theory and the idea that we don't really know exactly how to prevent conflict, but this seems to be a really important guide. Let's spread democracy, and democracy will take care of everything else. So implications of liberalism for IR is much more optimistic. Institutions themselves may not eradicate conflict and generate cooperation, but they help states to at least try and do so. There are many criticisms of the approach. Is it neo-imperialistic? Many of these institutions were set up by Western states and are dominated by them today. There's also the problem that democracy is great, but the transition to democracy itself can be very bloody. And in fact, democratically transitioning states are more likely to fight wars than other kinds of states. So now we're on the last one, constructivism or idealism. And the idea here is that reality is actually constructed, that everything I've said up to now is just ways of thinking about the world. And you could conceive of it completely differently. And the famous summary is this term from Alexander Wendt's book, Anarchy is what states make of it. Okay, we're in anarchy. Why do we think we're in anarchy? What can we do? We can create any kind of world we want. So the idea here is essentially much more sort of social science, constructivist approach, suggesting that international relations is fundamentally shaped by ideas, norms and values. Realism, for example, would be one example of these ideas, which is itself shaping the world as well as the discipline. It has some problems, a bit like some of the problems with liberalism. It's sort of a Western approach to some extent, and the idea is that good ideas need to be spread from the West. There's many critiques of that, but this is one of the problems with the otherwise optimistic view. So what are the implications? Well, it's not necessarily optimistic or pessimistic, it depends. Because those ideas and norms, like we should conserve biodiversity, can be very good, but they can also be very bad. And in Jack Snyder's table, he had Osama bin Laden alongside Gandhi as two examples of ideas and norms which did change the world. But it's generally optimistic, because it at least suggests that states are not predestined for conflict, so that cooperation can be actively promoted. So thinking back to that chart of the three fields, where should conservation geopolitics fit? I think it fits somewhere down at the bottom end of the constructivists and the liberalists. So to summarize what I've said, here are the three mainstream theories of international relations. There's actually dozens or maybe hundreds, but they can be broadly grouped like this. Here are the key elements, and here's the very different perspectives they give on the possibility for cooperation. Now I want to zoom in on one particular issue. One could look at many, but I was inspired a few years ago to think about the role of territory, and I think it's really important because of its impact on conservation, which knows no borders. So this is the very nice picture you had on the conference website. I think it speaks 1,000 words. As I noted, in international relations there are no laws. The closest thing is perhaps democratic peace theory. But there is one other very striking regularity in international politics, and it's territory. So this might be a biologist's view of the world, looking at the biomes and the habitats and the landscapes. And this would perhaps be a kind of ideal way of viewing the world, starting from scratch if we were to ditch economics, as we were thinking about earlier before lunch. This is perhaps a political scientist's view of the world. Okay? Forget the habitat, the landscapes, the biomes. What matters on a map for a political scientist is these lines, these borders between states. Now you could say, well, actually that matters in nature too. And certainly animals are very territorial, but I think humans forget how territorial we are. If you can't read it at the back, this is a dad saying to his son, "Now, Randy, by use of the song, the male sparrow will stake out his territory, an instinct common in the lower animals." But you'll note the little fences between everyone's houses. And every inch of the earth is divided up into private territory. And this is a big problem because territorial conflict turns out to be the most significant form of conflict in the data. Territoriality is striking even in times of peace. You look at the map and it's a picture of territoriality. Think about its role in times of war. It turns out that territorial disputes are the most common cause of war. In the data from 1648, the beginning of the modern nation-state system, territorial disputes actually account for almost 80% of all wars. If you look more recently, after the Napoleonic era, it's still a very significant amount. There's two different types of data here. One is wars only, this one is all forms of military escalation. But in both cases, it's somewhere between a quarter and half of all wars or conflicts are stemming from territorial conflict. They have special characteristics. They're more likely to lead to wars, we've discussed. They're more likely to lead to recurrent conflicts. Even if the wars stop, people start fighting again over these territorial issues. And they're more likely to result in high fatalities when war occurs. So territory is a real problem. And in particular, territory regarded as homeland becomes very violently contested. So it's a special problem that's hard to resolve. We don't need to think very hard about some examples. Israel-Palestine, for example, Kashmir. I don't know if you've seen this map. This is Chinese claims in the South China Sea. And the red dashed line here is China's claims, which is everything in that sea. And then all of the other ones are different claims to different islands or shoals by all these other different countries. And these are disagreements which are going to have to be resolved in the coming years. Now, the good side, the good, the bad, and the ugly, here's the good bit. If we think about the things which are a problem, like territory, it leads to potential solutions. So territorial cooperation is notable. You may be familiar with Ellen Ostrom, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who looked at indigenous societies and how they manage common pool resources. Maybe we can learn from them rather than our own failed efforts of the last couple of centuries. And she had this list of key design features that you need for effective management of common pool resources. And number one on that list is that you must have a clearly defined territory. If you don't, it's very hard to achieve cooperation over those common pool resources. The territory can be shared, but you've got to say where it is. Collective action problems, interestingly, arise precisely when resources are dispersed over space and time. If they're uniformly distributed in the environment, then you can just slice them up and treat them as private property. When they're unpredictable, we have to share them. And David won't have missed the point that this suggests that the resource dispersion hypothesis might underlie some new understandings of why we see conflict in some places and not others. And there's some data from indigenous societies showing that war in small-scale societies is actually statistically associated with the unpredictability of resources, not its abundance, not how much there is, but how predictable are those resources that we can access. And then finally, resolving territorial disputes turns out to be critical to conflict resolution. Okay, you might try and stop the conflict, but it turns out what you've got to do is resolve the territorial issue underlying it. Because when that is achieved, then we know statistically that afterwards you subsequently get demilitarization and democratization, which are much more likely to emerge if you solve the territorial problem. So, if territory is a problem, I think it might be a problem that's going to get worse. So just as an example, in Africa, for example, we're going to have another 1 billion people in the next 50 years. We already know about the problem of decreasing resources, and territorial conflict is likely then to become more important. Not necessarily it's going to happen, but it's become a bigger issue that needs to be resolved. Populations are growing, resources declining. There's also the problem of territorial disputes expanding into different domains. So we're fighting over territory in the Antarctic, or in space and radio frequencies and so on. There's also the problem of the so-called resource curse. And again, this is something that I feel should be explored from the point of view of conservation geopolitics. You may all be very familiar with this, that states with abundant natural resources that have lower economic growth, less democracy, poor development, and typically more war. Those are precisely the countries where the biodiversity is under greatest threat. And we know that statistically, again, oil in particular seems to be associated with conflicts. And the commodities, often people think, oh, it's diamonds and things as well. In this study, at least by Michael Ross, those things seem to prolong wars, even if they don't necessarily cause them. So there's huge challenges ahead. Territorial conflict is already the worst kind of conflict. And going forward, it's likely to be even more important than it has been already. And the time is up, so I'm just going to end on this slide, which is our project at the Martin School called Natural Governance, which is trying to think about cooperation and conflicts in the international setting with a view to understanding international relations a little differently by looking at ideas from ecology and evolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dom. We have time for one question.
You said that conflicts in indigenous societies were linked to the unpredictability of resources. Could we make the same hypothesis for peace in Europe? Do you think that the era of peace that we have had is a consequence of the mechanization of agriculture with predictable harvest? So then when your future is predictable, you don't have an incentive to go to war?
So that's an interesting idea. It could be. I would worry about the longer timescale suggests that Europe has been, the most bloody part of the world over the last few centuries, and we've enjoyed 70 years of peace. So it looks good for now, but who knows? And one thing I didn't say is that we've lived through 50 years of a bipolar world with two big superpowers, and now we're in this unipolar world with one big superpower. And we're about to go back into a world of multipolar politics where we have many rising powerful states. So there'll be many great powers in the system again, which we haven't had since before the Second World War. So although I like to, be optimistic, the worry is that we will return to something a bit more like the past, at least in the pressures and motivations of the great powers. Europe, I would argue, that's one potential mechanism underlying peace in Europe. Other people would say it's to do with democracy, that it's the exemplar, if you like, of the democratic peace hypothesis, and that's what's stuck them together.
Thank you. Thank you, Dom.